Hello everyone, Charcoal here, and welcome to the channel's 3-year anniversary. It's been a heck of a ride, and I'm looking forward to what's coming next. I'll elaborate on that in a very important channel update coming tomorrow, but right now we have bigger fish to fry. Over the past few years, I have talked a lot about Wings of Fire, and as of my Brightest Night review a few weeks ago, almost every book in the series has been discussed in at least one video on my channel. So now I'm gonna go back through and rank all of them from worst to best. I'll talk briefly about each entry and assign them a letter grade from A to F. F is terrible, D is just bad, C is okay, B is good, A is great, and S is the closest I feel Wings of Fire has come or ever will come to perfection. Now, this list will only include books from the main canon, those being the 15 main series books, 2 legends, and 4 winglets, making for a total of 21 books. The graphic novels are not on this list because they're not part of the main canon novels. I consider them to be their own universe. Accessory books like Forge Your Dragon World and the coloring book won't be included either since they're not stories, they're just activity books. As I just said, I've talked about all the books on this list before, but fair warning, my opinions on some of them have changed a bit with time. And as always, this is just my opinion, and all of these rankings are completely subjective. Feel free to like a book that I don't, or hate one that I love. I think that's enough dawdling. Let's dive in. Number 21. Legends Dragonslayer. If you've seen my videos, there shouldn't be any doubt I would put Dragonslayer at the bottom of the list. There is absolutely no other book in Wings of Fire that deserves this spot more. For one thing, it breaks the immersion of what Wings of Fire is supposed to be. I read this series for escapism, for an epic story about a world of dragons, to not have to worry about humanity for a while, so when this book comes along and makes humanity the main focus, that connection to what makes Wings of Fire special is broken. I don't necessarily dislike the idea of a Wings of Fire book about humans. We all know how humans are portrayed from the dragon's perspective. A story about them has potential to be pretty fun, but Dragonslayer missed that mark. Out of the 3 protagonists, the only one whose story feels like a Wings of Fire story is Ren, and her plot isn't perfect, but it's really the only part of the book that I genuinely found interesting. Ivy and Leaf's plots are both boring and predictable and can fit into basically any fantasy book. Whenever I came across an Ivy or Leaf chapter, all I thought was, when can we get back to Ren? Peeling away the human thing for a second, let me reiterate. This is a book with 3 rotating protagonists, 2 of whom constantly feel like they're just wasting my time. And for the longest book in the series by far, at 496 pages, that's a lot of time wasted. I said before that I think Dragonslayer would have worked better as a winglet, and I still stand by that. If this was just a one-off short story about Ren and Sky, I don't think it would be at the bottom of this list, but instead it's a 500-page snorefest that I have no desire to revisit, and is now an ugly marker of the worst mistake ever made with this series. I should clarify that being bad by Wings of Fire standards is still much more enjoyable than a lot of other books I've had to read, for high school English class for example, but I am judging these by Wings of Fire standards, and by those standards, Dragonslayer is awful. This just didn't feel like the series I fell in love with all those years ago. It's messy, plain boring, and way off the mark of what Wings of Fire is supposed to be. F. Number 20. Book 15, The Flames of Hope. Okay, this is going to contradict my original review of this book, I know, opinions change. But The Flames of Hope is a complete mess. This book was left with way too much to tie up to begin with, and then it continues to drag for the first half, so the second half goes way too fast. Queen Wasp, who was the villain of this arc prior to this, gets dealt with as an afterthought by a completely new character who was just properly introduced in this book. And she doesn't even die? If you care so little about her, why is she still alive? As for Cottonmouth and Freedom, I love the psychological horror, and Freedom's little arc is nice, but I don't like how the Breath of Evil is controlled by a human, especially one that has 0 personality. In a way, this book is like a perfect little microcosm of everything wrong with the third arc. Screwy pacing, bland villains, good ideas that unfortunately went to waste, way too much going on for its own good, and it can't decide if it wants to be an epic fantasy thriller or a happy-go-lucky hugfest. Speaking of being indecisive, is Tui writing a 4th arc or not? We've gotten no official confirmation about this as far as I'm aware, and The Flames of Hope can't seem to make up its mind on whether it wants to be the series finale or not. Since we have no confirmation, and since I really hope the series doesn't continue after seeing the stupid, happy, everyone is special direction it went in, I am choosing to judge this book as the series finale, and it was awful on that front. We don't see anyone but the third arc gang in the epilogue, and that sense of closure is nowhere to be found. I don't hate this book though. There are a lot of things in here that could have worked really well, but 3 moons, the execution was messy and frustrating. D. Number 19. Book 14, The Dangerous Gift. I was extremely torn on whether to place this above Book 15 or not, but I eventually decided I prefer this one for the sole reason that I wasn't left wondering what the f did I just read upon finishing it. Whereas The Flames of Hope is a mess because it had too much to wrap up and was just kind of meh all the way through, The Dangerous Gift is a mess because it does too little and has a pretty even mix of moments I really loved and moments I really hated. But the moments I hated with a burning passion, and they really drag it down. I love Lynx as a character, I love Jerboa's backstory, I love how serious the Othermind situation is treated with getting all the queens together, but I don't like the reveal of what happened to Animus magic being swept under the rug, I hate how clunky Snowfall's development was, and I despise how humans were handled. Why do all of the queens see one talking scavenger and immediately decide they'll protect them now? Why? Seriously, this pisses me off to no end, more than anything else in the series. Ugh. The best thing about the book is getting to properly see Pyria again. It felt really good to see a bunch of old faces one last time before the end. That doesn't excuse this book's many faults though. If it actually did more for solving the plot and all the stupid human stuff was taken out, this would probably rank higher. I'm gonna give The Dangerous Gift a D+, not much more to say than that. Number 18. Winglets number 1, Prisoners. This book isn't so much bad as it is utterly pointless. What reason does anyone have to read Prisoners? It's incredibly short and basically nothing happens in it. It tries to flesh Fierceteeth out a bit and make her a more likable character, but it just doesn't work. It's shown that she was always an egotistical brat and has no intention of changing. If the protagonist has no arc, then there's no story. Things just happen, and none of it is interesting because it's presenting the audience with information that they'd already know going into this. The only new information we get is explaining how she escapes prison to set up her very brief appearance in Book 9. Book 9 came out almost 2 years after Prisoners, but I read Book 9 first and never wondered for a second how Fierceteeth escaped jail. Thankfully the other Winglets would end up being way better, but for this one, I don't see how I can rank such a nothing book any higher. I don't think it's bad though. I can safely call Prisoners the first okay book on this list. C-. Number 17. Book 4, The Dark Secret. The word I'd use to describe Book 4 is disappointing. Just very, very disappointing. This was supposed to be the culmination of so many things that were set up in the first arc before this. The False Dragoness of Destiny, the Secret Nightwing Kingdom, the Rainwing Prisoners, etc. But for most of the book, nothing really happens. The False Dragonets never do anything, Starflight doesn't do anything until the end, the Night Kingdom is barely fleshed out at all despite nearly the entire book taking place in it, and the entire Nightwing tribe is handed to glory on a platter with the laziest reasoning ever. Starflight in this book is just unfortunate. I relate to him a lot, but he was done so dirty here, and that's what hurts the most. He spends the first 2/3 getting dragged around and shit on, and then after he finally does stuff, which I'll admit is really fun and exciting and probably the only good part of the book, he gets blinded by some lava. It's not like that was a major character moment for him, and it's never even important later, so what was the point of that? The Dark Secret should have been the biggest book so far at this point, but it feels so empty. I'm also giving it a C-. Number 16. Book 12, The Hive Queen. And the pointlessness continues. The Hive Queen doesn't do anything particularly bad, but it doesn't do anything super noteworthy either. It just kinda exists right in the middle. The main thing that brings this book down is how forgettable it is, because so little in it is actually followed up on again. The Chrysalists, they burn down an entire hive off screen and then never do anything important again. Cricket's birth parents? Katydid also never does anything again, and Malachite reappears in book 15, but again does nothing important. The Hive rulers rebelling against Wasp? Never a thing again. The only things in this book that actually stuck around were the reveal of how Wasp is able to control her subjects, and Bumblebee, who I actually like because she gives us a much better comic relief character than Swordtail. As a self-contained story, the Hive Queen is fine and has a lot of pretty fun ideas, but in the grand scheme of things, it's just unimportant and forgettable. C. Number 15. Book 2, The Lost Heir. The one thing that places The Lost Heir above the Hive Queen is that rather than being unimportant and forgettable, it's unimportant but memorable. Some of what was introduced here was followed up on in later books, like the Albatross lore that got expanded on in Darkstalker, and Anemone who'd become very fleshed out and developed in the second arc. The Sea Wings are one of the more unique tribes, and this book is remembered for introducing us to them, and it gave us some iconic scenes like Whirlpool's death and the Summer Palace bombing. However, the book itself isn't very good. The plot is super disjointed, the pacing is all over the place, and Queen Coral is incredibly inconsistent, jumping between whatever the story needs her to be at any given time. And while the scenes I mentioned are cool, they're ultimately unrelated to the book's actual plot of Tsunami solving the princess murders. They're just kinda there to pad out time and squeeze in more action. The Lost Heir isn't a bad book, but it's definitely one of the weaker ones of the first arc. I'm also gonna give it a C. Number 14. Book 7, Winter Turning, and Arc 2 finally makes an appearance. Is it clear where my bias lies yet? Honestly, the second books in each arc rank about the same for me. They're all relatively disconnected side stories that don't have much to do with the main plot. But I think this one, despite being kinda weak, is actually pretty fun. This book can be split up into two halves, the pretty boring first half and the actually good second half. The first half feels really slow, not much happens, and the only thing that really saves it is the banter between Winter and Ghibli. Like, oh my god, these two bounce off of each other really well, and I want to watch a buddy comedy starring them. Once Pyrite comes into play, things pick up a lot. All the stuff in the Ice Kingdom is genuinely enjoyable, but I'm frustrated that it wasn't the focus of the book to begin with. Especially because this is our first real visit to the Ice Kingdom and one of the only times this arc has us exploring a new location. The two sections average out to make a book that's just decent. It's nothing great, and I have quite a few gripes with it, but it's a fun ride at least. C+. Number 13. Book 11, The Lost Continent. Okay, I know, another third arc book in the bottom half of the list, but come on, this arc is a mess. The beginning is alright though. It's interesting to see an all-new setting for the first time. Some of the new characters like Lady Scarab, Io, and Admiral are all really fun, and I desperately wish Io and Admiral actually did more in the series following this. It does suffer from a few problems though. This was an opportunity to soft reboot the series and bring in a fresh set of readers who may be put off by the fact that there were at least 10 other books before this one, but it fails to stand on its own from the very beginning by tying all of its most important lore into existing stuff that new readers wouldn't know about, aka Clearsight. Side note, Clearsight breeding an entire tribe out of existence will never make sense to me, and come to think of it, neither will Luna somehow getting blown across the ocean in an accidental web of her own silk. Also, the plot of this book is very basic. This is pretty much every dystopian story ever, and Blue is not a proactive character at all, making him a very boring protagonist. It's still an enjoyable read though. I can't call this book great, hell I struggle to even call it good, and honestly I probably should have put this below Winter Turning if I'm basing these on general enjoyment, but screw it, I'm feeling generous so it can go here. If anything, it's a fun novelty to look back at a time when this arc actually had a more focused vision of what it wanted to be. C+. Number 12. Book 10, Darkness of Dragons. At long last, we've reached the first one that I genuinely like, although just barely. Darkness of Dragons is a very flawed book. The entire first half has basically nothing to do with the main plot when it very easily could have been worked in, but damn, it's great to sit back and just watch Ghibli and Winter have an adventure together. Again, I would watch a buddy comedy starring these two. Just lock them in a room together and it's a guaranteed fun time. Ghibli's character shines the most here too, which turned him into one of my all-time favorites. Vulture could have been a really good villain, but I feel like he wasn't used to his full potential, and all the stuff with Onyx was totally pointless. The second half isn't nearly as good, but it's alright. Ghibli has a pretty good arc, and his talk with Darkstalker at the end is one of my favorite moments of the series, but I will never be okay with how Darkstalker's defeat was handled. I've said before that he should have recognized his wrongdoings and chosen to start over as Peacemaker, or just outright die, and yeah, that ending would have worked so much better. Book 10 wasn't a great finale to the second arc, but I still find it very enjoyable. It really rides that line between okay and good for me, it depends on my mood, but that means every entry from this point on is good, if not great. Darkness of Dragons gets a B-. Number 11. Winglets number 4, Runaway. I really don't have much to say about Runaway. I think it's good, but honestly, it's nothing too special. The main reason this exists was to flesh out how Arctic and Foeslayer fell in love to make their relationship more believable, and it does that just fine. But it's hard to feel sympathy for Arctic when, at the time this came out, we already knew how horrible of a father and partner he would end up becoming. And cramming 3 rotating protagonists into a book that's already pretty short didn't help either. Wait, 3? Arctic, Foeslayer, and oh yeah, Arctic's arranged fiancé Snowflake is a main character in this too. Her story is interesting enough, and her relationship with Snowfox is really cute and all, but I feel like it takes time away from the ship the book was supposed to be developing. So instead of being something really interesting, it's just fine. That's what I call Runaway. Just fine. It's not great, but it accomplished what it set out to do well enough. B. Number 10. Book 9, Talons of Power. This book is part 1 of the second arc's climax, and it's solid. Turtle makes a pretty interesting protagonist, the hero who never wanted to be a hero. And I like how through his story we at least attempt to learn the ins and outs of animus magic. Attempt being the operative word here, because as we all know, animus magic is still incredibly vague and overpowered even after this. Talons of Power's standout character is definitely Anemone. Book 6 already showed us some changes in her from the last arc, but it didn't get a lot of focus. Book 9 puts Anemone front and center to give her the development she needed, and I am all here for it. When Book 8 revealed Turtle as an Animus, I thought, that's weird that we happen to have 2 Royal Animus Sea Wings now, but then this book clears that right up by revealing all the new history about Turtle and Anemone and how Anemone actually got her powers. The biggest issue here would have to be the pacing. For most of the book, the story just moves so slow, and there's barely any action until the end. The one action scene we do get is really good, but the rest of the book isn't nearly as fun or interesting. But Talons of Power is still a very solid book. B. Number 9. Book 13, The Poison Jungle, and here we have the outlier of the 3rd arc. The Poison Jungle is really good, but it still leaves quite a bit to be desired. The Leaf Wing Kingdom is insanely underdeveloped despite having the entire book devoted to it. Their only real defining trait is being split into 2 factions, and that's it. There are plenty of positives here though. First of all, Sundew and Willow are genuinely one of the best ships in the series. Usually when a Wings of Fire protagonist finds themselves with a partner, at best it's cute but ultimately pointless. But Sunlow is one of only like 2 ships in the entire series where I think their character dynamic can only work as a relationship. This book also advances the plot arguably more than the previous 2 combined, between the Breath of Evil backstory, the reveal of the Other Mind, and the big evacuation to Pyria. Hawthorne was also a really fun character for the brief time he appeared, and I will always be frustrated at how soon they killed him off. He had so much potential. What is with this arc and abandoning all the best concepts way too early? The Poison Jungle is a very enjoyable book. Best of the 3rd arc by far, but being the best of a bad situation doesn't make it great. Still, a book I am very happy to place in my top 10. B. Number 8. Book 1, The Dragonette Prophecy. Here we are where it all began. The very first book of the series, and a damn good one at that. I love how it's not afraid to show blood and violence. It really sets the tone for the series to come. And as you all know, I love Queen Scarlet. Especially when Byrne is there for her to bounce off of, her theatrical side is super fun. My biggest gripe with it though is the fact that despite having a Mudwing protagonist, the only one in the series might I add, it focuses way too little on the Mud Kingdom. Clay just pays a brief visit at the end of the book and we never see it again. Most of the book focuses on the Sky Kingdom, and even in the 2nd arc when we could have finally given the Mudwing some focus, they're benched again. This is pretty much the only Mudwing content we ever get, and it's barely anything. Clay himself isn't very interesting here either. He's more of a reactive character than a proactive one, so he just gets dragged around wherever the plot needs him to go. It very much feels like Tui is just getting Clay out of the way first so she can devote future books to the more engaging characters. But despite my gripes with it, the highs of this book are high. Overall, The Dragonette Prophecy is a really solid introduction to the series, and as the first Wings of Fire anything, it just doesn't feel right to rank it any lower. B+. Number 7. Book 6, Moonrising. This thing is hands down my favorite introduction to any of the arcs. Since the majority of Pyria was already seen in the last arc, there wasn't nearly as much world to explore in this one, so it would have to rely on the characters to carry it, and Moonrising gave us just that. This is a very character-driven book. Kinkajou, Kibli, and Peril return from the last arc, we meet Winter and Turtle for the first time, and a bunch of side characters are set up here who will come into play later. Onyx was introduced and got some foreshadowing, and Anemone was reintroduced and has changed a lot since she last appeared in Book 2. Not everyone is a fan of how bratty she is here, but I think it makes sense for her character, and she does learn her lesson later on. They're not all perfect though. I'm baffled that not one person was suspicious of Onyx since she was a full-blown 20-something-year-old adult attending school with dragons who at most were young adults. Carnelian wasn't very likable, but she had a lot of potential to become more interesting down the road, but then she just went to waste in the History Cave bombing. Speaking of the bombing, Umber and Sora also had potential, but became one of the biggest loose ends in the series by never appearing again. The weakest character here though is Moonwatcher. She follows Clay's example of not doing much on her own volition. A good chunk of the fandom says Moon is a Mary Sue, which I don't entirely agree with, but I can see where they're coming from. Everyone is pretty quick to forgive her when they find out she can read minds, and Winter and Kibli start crushing on her almost immediately. But honestly, that love triangle deserves its own video. I really wish Moon's POV was placed near the end of the arc so she could have more to do with her powers. But Moonrising is a very fun book, and it's so close to being great, but I just can't quite put it up there. I can, however, happily put it at the top of the good tier. B+. Number 6. Book 3, The Hidden Kingdom. This was the first really good book of the series in my opinion. The first 2 books had some exploring, but not a whole lot. Book 3 said, you want exploration? I'll give you exploration. The rainforest, the Sand Kingdom, the borders of the Ice Kingdom, the secret Nightwing Island, pretty much any part of the continent we hadn't seen yet was shown in this book in some capacity. But despite seeing so many new places, this is the Rainwing book, and the rainforest is easily one of the most fleshed out locations on the map. The whole tribe is one of the most unique and developed ones out of all of them, and I love it. Glory has a pretty interesting story here too, when all the stereotypes her guardians tried to drill into her head turn out to actually be true. Glory managing to take the Rainwing throne still baffles me to this day. That was a huge twist. But the big thing dragging this book down is how that twist concluded. The whole book was trying to push the message that you're defined by who you choose to be, not by your heritage or what anyone else says about you. And Glory was about to prove just that by being a seemingly normal dragon who becomes queen with no special blood or power. So when Grandeur abdicates and hands Glory the throne because she turns out to have royal blood after all, that is really jarring and kind of ruins the ending. The rest of the book though is still really fun and interesting, enough that I can call The Hidden Kingdom the first book on this list to be worthy of the great tier, A-. Number 5. Book 5, The Brightest Night. This thing is wonderful. After 4 books of the Dragonets of Destiny causing even more chaos wherever they went, it's finally time for them to get on with stopping the Sandwing succession war like they were supposed to. Just one small problem. The prophecy that made them heroes in the first place has just been revealed to be fake, so now they have to solve the crisis their own way. Sunny gets a really nice story here, going from letting everyone push her around to being one of the biggest badasses of the group, second only to Glory. We visit the Sand Kingdom some more, and I like it, especially the Scorpion Den and the Outclaws. There's also some really good setup for Arc 2 between Scarlet being freed, the introduction of Kibli, and our first hints at Darkstalker. Now, this is 100% a tangent, but I forgot to mention it in this book's standalone video, so I'm gonna do it here. Let's look at the Dragonets of Destiny and compare how the girls and guys ended up. Tsunami was born a princess, Glory turns out to also be royalty and becomes queen of 2 tribes, and Sunny becomes a princess when her mother is declared the new Sandwing queen. Meanwhile, Clay gets a permanently crippled leg, and Starflight goes blind. I have no idea if this was intentional on Tui's part or just a weird coincidence. Either way, it doesn't affect my opinion. I just find it funny and thought it was worth mentioning. My biggest gripe is that it drags a lot in the middle. There are quite a few moments of lazy writing or characters being stupid, etc., but the ending more than makes up for it. I wish it had gone on longer, but it still works fine as is. It's got a big enough emotional punch that I actually almost cried on my latest reread. Or maybe that was just because I was delirious from reading it at 3 AM, who knows. But The Brightest Night is still a wonderful ending to Wings of Fire's first epic tale, and an entry I am overjoyed to have in my top 5. Another A-. Number 4. Winglets number 2, Assassin. Here we have the only book where I actually love Deathbringer. We've had Fierce Teeth question the Nightwing's plan back in the first Winglet, but Deathbringer is the first to start disagreeing with it, only going along with it because he knows he's a dead man if he turns on them. But he starts off the story blindly following orders, and it takes losing someone dear to him to snap him out of that. The whole scene of Tempest's assassination is fantastic, so much so that I chose it to be turned into a voice-acted map, which you should totally go watch when you're done here. A lot of work went into it. So where was I? As for other characters, Tempest was really fun, and I'm disappointed she's confined to just this book, and it's nice to see Gil with his sanity still intact. And the book gives some fun world building to the Sandwing War by showing how the Mudwings were originally allied with Blister. Unfortunately, this book is also responsible for confirming Deathbringer's age, leading to the whole pedophilia thing with Glory. I don't care if it was a mistake, what's written is what's written, so until this thing is reprinted with a new date, Deathbringer being twice as old as Glory is still the objective canon. But ignoring that line, Assassin is still a shining little gem of a story. It gets a solid A. Number 3. Book 8, Escaping Peril. Not only is this thing a great volume in general, but it's a very personal one to me, and I think that's why I placed it so high. Most of you watching probably know the story already, but back in early 2020, months before this channel was even a thought in my head, I was one of the founding members of Jade Mountain Library. Escaping Peril was our first project to start production in March 2020, the first one posted in May, and the first full-length audiobook we completed in September 2021. Unfortunately, JML closed its doors at the end of 2022, but the experience of directing the Escaping Peril audiobook is something I wouldn't trade for the world. Needless to say, over that year and a half I spent on it, I became very well acquainted with this book, and I can confidently call it one of my favorites. This was the big culmination to one of the series' longest-running plots, Queen Scarlet, along with finally giving Peril the spotlight she deserved. Scarlet is my favorite villain in Wings of Fire, bar none. I love charismatic manipulators because they're a good way to amp up the emotional struggle for the heroes. The villain gets inside the protagonist's head, and suddenly the conflict isn't all black and white anymore. It adds a layer of complexity by getting the hero to either believe the villain or be convinced to do some terrible things. That's basically what happens between Peril and Scarlet here, and I love it. My only real gripe is that it drags a bit in the middle. The whole section moves pretty slowly, but we do get some fun interaction between Peril and Turtle. By the end of the book, Scarlet is finally dead, Ruby solidifies her position as the Skywing Queen, and Peril is officially on the path to redemption. She's not there yet, but we get confirmation that she will improve, which we see in her appearances in the next couple books. So overall, Escaping Peril is an amazing book, made even better by the fact that it was one of the biggest influences that brought me here today. In my opinion, this is the best book of the main series, well deserving of an A+. So, only 2 books left, and if you've been paying attention, you know which 2 they are. Those of you who have been on my channel for a bit probably already know my picks, so enough beating around the bush. Number 2 on this list rightfully goes to Winglets number 3, Deserter. Deserter deserves the title of perfect in that I cannot name a single gripe I have with it that's anything more than a nitpick rather than genuine criticism. It very simply does everything right. Something I need to mention is the pacing. This is the best paced book in the series. It never feels like it's moving too fast, but at the same time it never feels slow or boring. Now let's talk about our star character, Six Claws. Holy crap, I love him. His first appearance was in Book 5, and this winglet alone turned him from a side character I thought nothing about to one of my all-time favorites. His story is nothing groundbreaking. He bases all his views on those of his friends and family, and when tragedy strikes, he finally starts making decisions for himself to pull his friend out of an awful situation. It's a simple moral, but frankly, one that spoke to me on a frighteningly personal level. When I relate to the protagonist enough to start genuinely questioning my life choices, that's how I know it's perfect. This book also takes some time to expand on other characters. Deathbringer gets a little continuation of his story from the previous winglet, and we basically learn Dune's whole backstory. When I reread Book 1 for my review of it, now knowing the events of Deserter, it really turned Dune from an unlikable character into a tragic one. Dude's been through hell with seemingly no real upsides. I feel so bad for him. The one thing keeping this winglet from the top spot is that it is just a winglet. It's a short story, nothing more, but it's not trying to be anything more, and that's okay. It knows what it is, and it works within that shorter format to deliver the best story it possibly can, one of the most entertaining I've ever read. And that's why I officially rank Deserter as S tier. When I think of what I want in a Wings of Fire book, I think the list can be summed up pretty well. I want an epic, fantastical tale that has me on the edge of my seat from start to finish. I want a story that can both make me laugh and make me cry. I want a story with such vivid imagery that I can place myself into each scene right alongside the characters, feeling what they feel. There is only one book in this series that I feel not only checks all of those boxes, but dares to be more. The best story Wings of Fire has to offer, and the #1 entry on this list, Legends Darkstalker. This book has it all. The characters, the tone, the lore, the drama, oh my god. Let's start with the premise. The first 3 winglets were already out by the time Darkstalker released, so part of me thinks those were Tui's way of testing the water with stories more focused on lore and not taking place in the main plot, and Darkstalker was about to go all in on it. There is one thing Darkstalker did that no other book in Wings of Fire had done before. Not counting prologues and epilogues, every book had followed one main character from beginning to end. Darkstalker was the first to give us 3 protagonists who rotate every chapter. The book absolutely nails the concept. They all have their own things going on while still feeling like 3 POVs of one grand tale. Clearsight is the weakest of the 3 in my opinion, but I still like her, in this book at least. Having her interact with the more common folk really helps to flesh out the old Night Kingdom and makes her more relatable to younger readers. And she has a really nice arc about getting over worrying about the future and gaining the courage to cut an abusive partner out of her life. Fathom, as you know, is my all-time favorite character of the series. He gets all the most emotional scenes, and they're so vivid I feel like I'm there with him. He also serves as a gateway to touch on some established lore from earlier in the series in the form of Albatross. But it's not just there as fan service, it's what kicks off his entire arc about fearing his powers. Fathom and Indigo are also my favorite romantic ship in the series, because the book takes place over multiple years so it feels more natural, and because of the trials they both have to go through as well as how they end up butting heads with each other before they can finally be together. It's such a satisfying ending. Darkstalker himself is an interesting case. Rather than experiencing a positive change arc like most protagonists, Darkstalker instead goes through a negative change, ending the story in a worse place than he started. He fully understands he's the most powerful being to ever exist, but that comes at the cost of nobody else being strong enough to give him a much needed dose of humility. That's a really nice switch up, and showing us the villain's POV demonstrates how even the most well-intentioned of people can still do awful things for what they feel is the greater good, especially when their only support system is just their own personal echo chamber. It doesn't excuse Darkstalker's actions at all, but it allows us to understand his motives and why he is the way he is, making him a much more compelling character now that he was front and center in the main series. Speaking of which, at this point the main series was up to book 8, so we already knew about some of the stuff that happened here. We know Darkstalker ends up being the villain and gets sealed away, we know Foeslayer goes missing, we know Arctic rips his own guts out, but the key detail going into this is that we know what happened, but not how it happened, which is what this book shows us. Do you need to read Darkstalker to understand books 9 and 10? No, but if you do read it, it makes several scenes much more emotional when characters talk about what happened here because now we know the context behind those events. Not only is this an amazing story on its own, but its existence actively improves the other books surrounding it. That, on top of the darker tone and some of the best characterization of the whole series, is why Legends Darkstalker is the best book in all of Wings of Fire, second to none. This is something truly special, and I don't think we'll ever get anything like it again. It's ambitious, it's emotional, it's epic, it is perfect. There's only one possible ranking for this thing: S tier. This has been, by far, the biggest video I've ever made. I just went through basically all of Wings of Fire, and I understand that some of my criticisms probably came off as a little harsh, but I want to make one thing clear. I love Wings of Fire. If I didn't, then this channel wouldn't even exist. But my love for the books is why I'm so critical of it. I know what this series is capable of, and I want it to be the very best it can be. We don't know yet if the story will continue, and yeah, given its track record for the past few years, part of me hopes it doesn't. I'd rather it end on an okay note than get dragged out and become worse. But if it does, I'd like to believe Tui would have a solid idea for it so the series can be genuinely good again. All we can do now is wait and see. But looking back through the entire series like this was really fun, and it has me more excited than ever for whatever it does next. Now it's fan art time. Only 3 pieces this time, and they're from Hot Cocoa Jr. Jr., Deleting Mars, and Hey It's Moss. Thanks a bunch, guys, and thank you all for all the support throughout these past 3 years. It's been a blast. This has been Wings of Charcoal, and stay tuned. Tomorrow, August 27th, for the actual 3-year anniversary, I'll be posting a major update video on what's to come for this channel. See you soon.